So, hello everyone. Welcome to this Learn and Share session. Today we have Pierre, who will be talking about private markets on Ethereum. And for this session, you can ask questions in the chat and also request to speak at the end of the presentation. And and thank you, Pierre, for presenting and welcome. And you can start whenever you want.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Vivian, for organizing this. I'm super happy to present this in front of PSC people and outside of PSC also. That's some work that I did with 0xPARC. So I'm also taking this opportunity to give thanks to 0xPARC for that, and of course now to give thanks to you, PSC, for hosting this session. So I'm going to switch screens right now. So that means that I'm not seeing the chat. So when people are asking questions, so I don't know what's the question policy, but if you feel that there is like some urgent matter that I did not tackle or urgent question, like don't hesitate to interrupt me because I will not have my eyes on the chat, Vivian. So I'm giving you the responsibility to interrupt me when
Yeah,
I'm
if you
going too
want, you
fast.
can answer all the questions at the end of the session, and that's
Yeah,
fine too,
yeah,
as you
definitely.
prefer.
All right, cool. Yeah,
Thank you.
perfect. Yeah, nice. Cool. So today I'm going to present you private market. So the subtitle is saying that it's about like how you can leverage ZK for trustlessly trading arbitrary computations. So it's kind of a bold subtitle because like we say arbitrary computations, and in this presentation we will actually like go through only 3 examples. But I think that those examples are like interesting because they tackle very different problems, and yet they all use the same scheme for it, and is what we call like the private market scheme in a way. And what's interesting is that this scheme is like basically generalizes to all of those 3 very different examples. So the session will go like in 5 parts. The first one will be like a bit of background because I was basically on the shoulders of giants. Like I did not invent this, and so I want to give you guys a bit of background on where this work is coming from. Then we'll go over like the relevant primitives. So what I want in that is to give you like the tools so that you can after this session like start to think in kind of theoretical terms about those constructions and eventually come up by yourself with like new things to build markets for. So that will be like a bit of the kind of the theory behind it, but it will be like pretty easy. Then we like describe the setup. So like when you assemble those primitives together, you actually end up with like a setup, so the private market setup, and we will go through it. And then we will go over like some example markets. So like setting private keys, setting signatures, setting even gross 16 proofs. So which was like, I think, one of the most interesting result of that work. And finally, I will go over like future directions for this work. Cool. So let's go over the background a bit. So actually, this work, there was some early work that was done by Nick Ulven, and this work was called ETH Data Marketplace. And it's a very interesting repo that I advise you to go check out if you are interested into those things, because it basically like lays out in a very smart way all of the primitives that basically private market leverage. So he lays out like 3 property proofs, and he leverage those property proofs for like different use cases. Like he says, okay, we can basically sell the pre-image of a hash, And we can also like actually like sell the hash of dark forest coordinates. So dark forest is an on-chain game. We can also leverage this for like proving the image blurring process that was done on some particular JPEG, for instance, using some random bitmap. And he actually gave a talk last year at ETH Amsterdam, where he was describing a setup for selling SegP 256K1 key pairs, so the kind of key pairs that are used on Bitcoin, for instance. And yeah, so it's a very interesting repo, and it was actually a very interesting talk. So go check it out. It was pretty early in a sense. So there is a second background that is also interesting and in which I was a bit more involved. Here it was not my idea. It was also an idea by Nick. So it was this idea of setting like the hash of some dark forest coordinates. But someone called 0xPARC came along and was like, okay, let's build actually a market for dark forest planets. And so we built what we called a night market. So dark forest is like an on-chain game where you can sell planets, conquer planets. And what we did was some kind of trustless market where you can sell the planets that you have conquered, because the planets that you are actually conquering in that game have like specific abilities or characteristics. So you can resell them because they can act as a strategic advantage to your allies or to your opponents. So it was a way for people to like make a bit of profit on Dark Forest while not getting into some weird Ponzinomics, basically. And so Night Market was a way to privately exchange planet coordinates by proving the properties, some properties about them. So for instance, I would say, so I have this planet with like that specific characteristic that is super interesting. I can zk prove it, this characteristic, but I can also zk prove to you that those coordinates are encrypted in a way that make it possible for you to later on decrypt those coordinates and get to know what is the special planet that I'm talking about and selling to you on that market. And so the general idea that we started to have was that what is provable is tradable. And that's quite an important idea, because anything that you can prove in by writing, for instance, a circuit about it. So let's say, for instance, that I want to prove that I know the square root of a number, or more generally, that I know some kind of result regarding some computation. If I can prove that I have correctly done that computation, then that means I can actually trade it, because I can give the proof that I know some witness that satisfies that computation. And you might be interested into that witness, and I can actually prove it that I know it, so I can sell it to you. So that's a pretty powerful idea. So let's go over the relevant primitives for that. So first, there is what we call the assertion proof. So we renamed it from property proof, which was a term used by Nick, because sometimes people were confused, because property could mean like some people would interpret it in a way that property meaning some property right, when actually what this does is just verifying that the data verifies some property that you are interested about. So the thing here that we do is we run some function that takes as an input some piece of data, some property that we want to verify about that piece of data, and we basically add a constraint that checks that this function returns true. And so when you do that assertion proof, you are basically convincing a buyer that the private piece of data that you are selling verifies the property that is being sold. Then the second relevant primitive is the encryption proof. So this proof is here to convince a buyer that the private piece of data has been encrypted using a desired key and scheme. So the little formula that you see on the right shows that if I am encrypting the data with some key and that I am decrypting that encrypted data with some key, I'm getting the data back. So that's what the proof will do. It will say, hey, I'm using this key and I'm using that encryption scheme. And when I encrypt it and then decrypt it back, I'm getting the data back. So that's the encryption proof. And we will need it because we will want to convince the buyer of the data that he will be able to decrypt the data that he's buying. Because when we will communicate that data on chain, of course, we don't want to send that data completely decrypted. We want to encrypt it so that this knowledge gets shared only between the seller and the buyer, and not everyone can access what I'm selling. So that's the encryption proof. So assertion proof, encryption proof, and commitment proof. That's the third important primitive, and it relates to the idea of commitment. And here, what we are proving to the buyer is that what is being sold and how it is sold verifies some earlier committed value. So let's say, for instance, that I'm committing to selling to you the private key of a particular address, then I am committing to that address. I cannot sell you the private key of some other address. So the commitment here would consist into proving that I'm selling to you the private key of the address that I have committed to earlier. Cool. So let's go over a very simple setup. So this setup consists into like selling an odd number. So it's just an example setup, and as you can presuppose, it's not an interesting use case, but a simple one that will maybe give you some intuition about how those primitives fit together. Cool. So let's say that Alice knows an odd number. So she will commit to this number by posting its hash on a smart contract. So she will hash this number in some way and commit to it on chain. So here it's written in blue because it relates to the commitment proof. Then what she will do is post her public key with which anyone can compute a shared key using, for instance, ECDH. So elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. And here it's written in red because it relates to the encryption proof, where the seller will show that he has encrypted the data, so here Alice, with some shared key. So second step, Bob comes along and wants to know what is this odd number. So he will compute his shared key with Alice using, again, ECDH, for instance, and he will commit to that shared key. So here it's like a mix of the commitment and of the encryption, but it's written in blue because Bob commits to a shared key, and Alice will have to prove that she has encrypted her odd number using that committed shared key. Also, he will escrow 1 ETH to pay Alice for this odd number. And Alice will come back in the picture now. So she will be able to sell to Bob her odd number. What she will need to do is first to show that her number is not divisible by 2. So that's the assertion proof, where she's proving some property related to the data that she's selling. It's in green. Then red, because she's doing some encryption proof. And she shows that she correctly encrypted the odd number using some encryption algorithm. And then the blue proof, so the commitment proof, she shows that she used the same shared key as Bob, and that the odd number that is being sold is the same as the one committed earlier. So Bob is now sure that he's buying the odd number that Alice committed to earlier. So yeah, that's how those three different primitives, the assertion proof, the encryption proof, and the commitment proof are all coming together to sell this odd number. Okay, so a small detour. You have two setups that you can think about. We'll not go into too much of details, but you have the bid or the ask setup. In the ask setup, what it consists of is to say, I know some piece of info and I'm asking X is for it. And so the flow will consist into saying, hey, I'm asking for X is. Someone comes along, order, so like Bob, escrow some is, and then I come back and I fill that order. In the bid setup, it's a bit different because here I come along and I say, I want to know some piece of info and I'm bidding X is for it. So in that case, I'm communicating to the outer world that I'm interested in some piece of info. And if someone has this piece of info, then it can come along and fill the bid that I'm doing. So when you do a sale using a bid setup, you have a reduced number of steps. But yeah, that's a small detail. So let's go over some example markets. Let's do some interesting markets that we can learn more things than selling an odd number. Okay, so let's do first Ethereum addresses. So in the case where we want to sell an Ethereum address on chain using that setup, first we'll have a seller that will come and that will say that he is asking for XETH for the private key of the address 0xABC. So we are in the ask setup basically, and the seller is like asking XETH for that. The buyer comes along and makes an order. So first he will escrow the ETH for the private key of this address. He will commit to some shared key that he has computed using the seller's public key. And he will also post his public key to let the seller also carry out his CDH on his side. The seller comes and fills the order. He will compute a proof consisting of a property proof, so the assertion proof that we were talking about, which consists into proving that the private key resolves to some Ethereum address, the encryption proof, and finally the commitment proof. So the encryption proof proves that he encrypted the private key with the shared key, and the commitment proof proves that the shared key resolves to the address that he was talking about earlier. And finally, the buyer can decrypt the secret key that has with the shared key that he has computed and which has been the encryption is posted on chain. So it just pulls the data back from the chain and decrypts it with the shared key that he computed earlier. Cool. So now let's talk about eDDSA signatures. You can do it for private keys. You can do it also for signatures. So selling signatures is actually quite similar again. So the seller comes and here he's just making a different, he's just expressing something different. He's just saying, for instance, I can sign data with this particular private key to which a public key is associated, and I actually commit to this public key on chain. So if someone comes along and if he wants to, I can sign some stuff with this private key. And let's say that there is a buyer that is interested. He wants maybe his message to be signed by this public key, maybe to access some service. And so he comes and he does the same thing again. He is posting his public key, he is posting some data related to the signature algorithm, and he is also posting the hash of the shared key again. The seller comes, checks that the hash resolves to some committed public key, and here is signing the hash of the public key in that setup, and is just proving in that case that the signature he has done is correct. and that the data related to the signature is also encrypted correctly, so that when the buyer comes back, he can decrypt the signature and use it anywhere he wants. So this is a way, for instance, to tell, let's say, some signature over some particular message. And so let's say this message would be, I want to access this service. Then I can ask to someone who has the key to generate a signature over that message to generate a message for me, so then I can also access that service on my end. Then you can also sell gross 16 proofs. And I think that's where it was also like very interesting to do this work. It actually did not start with, let's say, gross 16 proofs. It started with some other idea. So the idea that we wanted to realize in the beginning with private market was to allow anyone to sell their ability to post messages into zk-gated group. So I don't know if you have heard about like Heyanon, but Heyanon was some project that was proposing for people that were able to prove some property regarding their Ethereum address. So for instance, I can prove that I own some kind of NFT to start posting messages on some Twitter account. So that makes this app what we call a ZK-gated app, because to access the functionality of the app, you have to provide a proof using ZK that your Ethereum address has a particular NFT. So in the case of Anon, the proof was consisting, for instance, of a Merkle path and a signature as private inputs. And we are like, okay, so let's tell the Merkle path and the signature directly. But of course, if you do that, you would be doxing yourself, because you would, if you wanted to sell you access to it, you would basically give with it the Merkle path and the signature. So you would be saying, hey, that's this public key that is giving that access to you. So we could not naively sell Merkle paths and signatures for that. And instead, what we came up with was, well, let's use recursivity, because recursivity would allow us to tell the proof itself without divulging the input to the proof. And an app like Anon is not expecting to see the inputs of the proof, of course. It's just expecting to see a valid proof. And recursivity would make it possible to sell gross 16 proofs that make it possible to access those kind of services directly without divulging any data about the Merkle path and the signature. Okay, so let's go over how that works. So here the buyer comes and says, in the case of Rhiannon, he says, I can generate a proof for this particular group. So a group here is some groups that has some exclusive rights to post some messages on Rhiannon. And the seller comes and says, I can generate a proof for this particular group and this particular verification key. And so the verification key is this device in a way that is in charge of verifying the proofs. And so he's saying that I can generate a proof for that particular verification key, so that you are sure that you are buying the proof that results, that will be verified that as true from this particular verification key, and not for some other verification key that you are not interested in. So the seller comes along and orders this proof on the market, and he commits to his public key, again, some signature data, and some shared key that he wants to use for the encryption. And then what the seller will do is prove that the gross 16 proof being sold is correct, that it has been also correctly encrypted, that the encryption key is correct, the verification key is correct, and that the message hash is correct. What is the message hash in that case? Well, in that case, actually the seller comes and asks, for instance, for posting a particular message in this group. And the buyer will simply show that the message hash that he has signed and for which he has provided also some Merkle proof for the public key that is in that group is correct. So that's why we are talking about the message hash here. But the big picture is that the seller comes and says, I can access this group. The buyer, sorry, comes and says, oh, okay, I think I have interchanged buyer and seller on that picture. So if you're confused, that's normal. But seller is on the left and buyer is on the right. But basically, the big picture is that the seller comes and says, I can access this group. The buyer says, I'm interested. Please generate a proof for accessing the group. And I want to post that specific message. And the seller says, no problem. He generates the proof. He also signs the message that the buyer wants to post in that particular group. And he encrypts the proof. And then eventually the buyer can come, decrypt the proof, and submit that proof to that zk-gated app so that he can then post the message in the group that he was not supposed to access. So where does recursivity comes in? Well, if we go from the left to the right, we will see how the proof generation process works. So firstly, you see on the left, there is two kinds of inputs. There is public inputs, which is the root of the group that we want to access to. So often that group is represented as a tree, and the root is a public signal to the proof that we are generating. And there is also a message that is public. And then you have some private inputs. So a Merkle path, a signature, and a pub key. Those things are not supposed to be known to the buyer of the proof. So first, the seller will generate the anon proof for that, showing that he is supposed to access the group. And then the recursive step will come in the second step, where it consists into showing that you are selling a valid proof of a anon proof. So that's the big red circle where the circuit will check that the proof that you are selling is correct, that the encryption of this proof is also correct, and that it has been encrypted with a shared key that is also correct. And so the outputs of that will be a root, a message, and some encrypted proof that the buyer will then be able to decrypt and post into the zk-gated dApp. But it's not a perfect world, and the issue is that this was a very expensive circuit. So I think it's above 20 million constraints. So I clearly went above my AWS budget for that. And it was pretty expensive, both in terms of computation and in terms of money. But it was still a very interesting experiment. Cool. So let's check what all this means. What does it mean that anything that is provable is tradable? And that includes private keys, signatures, gross-16 proofs, and whatever kind of provable computation that you can think of. So first, I think that a cool perspective is that you can have a world of nice dApps that can come out of this. So for instance, selling private keys, well, you can actually think about ways to leverage account abstraction and some kind of rotating key pair that is working on the abstracted account that you are using. And then you end up with a way to rent your wallet with that key. Also selling signatures, well, it's also a nice way to do in a pure Web3 native way of handling subscriptions. So let's say, for instance, that I'm a digital newspaper and I want to sell subscriptions. And the way I can log in into my website is using signatures. Well, people can actually buy those signatures on-chain, trustlessly and anonymously to access my service. It's also a pretty cool way, for instance, to handle subscriptions. Also, selling gross 16 proofs is a nice way of, for instance, giving a voice to those that could not access an app. For instance, I know that there is some really cool project going on in the Nouns DAO with some uh, um, some Reddit-like ZK-gated app for expressing and discussing governance proposals. But the thing is that a noun costs like a lot. And so if you have something that you would want to say about nouns, but you do not have enough ETH to buy a noun, and someone deems your message interesting, but wants to remain anonymous while selling you the access, well, you can do that using the market construction. And in general, it actually gives some pretty interesting utility to your NFT because it means that you can now start to use your NFT to generate proofs about it and sell back those proofs to people that are interested into accessing the ZK gated app. And of course, there is a lot of other dapps that can be, I think, created using that scheme. And I would be like super excited to see what they look like. A second interesting idea, I think, is that these constructions makes liquid illiquid things. So private keys are actually not meant to be sold. ZK gated groups are not meant to be opened. And if you can now build markets around those, well, this means that those peer-to-peer markets are making liquid, illiquid digital assets. And so that's very interesting because I'm not sure that we have fully explored what are the implications of this kind of idea because I don't know how liquid or how liquid are supposed to be private keys or how liquid are supposed to be ZK gated groups because often those ZK gated groups, for instance, are built with the assumption that this is a good mechanism for civil protection, but it also asks questions about, well, if I can sell the proofs that are the key to let people enter that group, well, that can pose sometimes some questions and yet also propose very interesting design opportunities for the makers of those ZK-gated dapps. Yes, so thank you, and I will now take your questions.
Thank you so much. Do we have questions? Yes, we have in the chat.
Yes. So is it possible for ZK-gated groups? Yes. So that's a very interesting question, and this is possible. And I think this is a restriction, and it's also like a design choice. So ZK-gated groups, I think, can like add some rules with respect to what kind of proofs can be provided to access the app, and maybe, for instance, design some mechanisms for proofs value. So, for instance, you could imagine a market where proofs of second order value are sold. And those proofs of second order value, for instance, are used for accessing channels where only people that have bought those proofs of second order value can access to. So it's an example of adding some restrictions for those ZK gated groups. And yeah, I think that's an interesting design poll to turn around and to explore because a lot of things can be tweaked and thought about regarding which kind of restrictions you want to add on top of your zk-git tab. Yeah. Thanks for this question. Cool. I don't know if there is any other questions, Vivian.
People can request to speak to if you want. Let's wait 1 minute to see if someone wants to ask more questions.
Seems like it was very clear. Cool.
Yeah, yeah.
I-
So thank you so much,
Thank you, Vivian.
and thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Pierre, for the presentation. Someone is typing. Yeah, thank you,
Thank you,
thank
guys.
you all,
Thank you.
thank you,
Thank you, Vivian. Very nice
thank you,
from you for organizing this.
thank you so much.
Bye bye. See you.
Bye, bye.